does not have a ministry in a earthly tabernacle, but that he sits on the right hand of God ministering in a heavenly tabernacle, one that was not created by man, but one that was created by God. We talked about if Christ were to be a priest based on that earthly system, he would not qualify because he was not from the tribe of Levi, and they had Levitical priests to sort of minister there. But Christ is of the order of Melchizedek. His priesthood is completely different than the earthly priesthood, and he functions in a different location. We talked about last week, if that original covenant that God had made with Israel would have been without fault or had been capable of bringing about salvation, then there would have been no need for a new covenant. There would be no need for a new priest. But as we know, the sacrificial system was incapable of bringing about forgiveness. No matter how many sacrifices they offered, it could not do away with the penalty of sin. To overcome the problem of sin, God said that he would make a new covenant. We talked about that, right? It was a new covenant that started on the inside and worked its way on to the outside. By changing our hearts, God gave us a new capacity to be obedient to him, to follow after him, to serve him, even to love him. This new covenant would be an internal covenant. It would be a personal covenant between God and man. We talked about that before, how the relationship that we have with Jesus Christ is between us and God. You cannot do anything to merit salvation for your children as much as you would like to, because it's a personal commitment between them and God. This new covenant was very personal, right? We talked about how the veil in the sacrificial system, the priest had to go behind the veil there, into the Holy of Holies, once a year and offer sacrifices on behalf of the people. That veil, that priestly system, separated people from God. And God didn't do that so that he might be separated from people, but to make the point that there was a gap between mankind and God, and Jesus Christ came to do away with that gap. The Mosaic Law, the Old Testament system, Levitical priesthood, would help to define worship. Hebrews 9 explains how Christ is a better approach to God than that pattern that was given by God to the nation of Israel. They did not come up with this system on their own. Now, many of the priests and the Sadducees and the Pharisees, they added to the laws that God set, but God had set up the tabernacle. He told Moses how to build the tabernacle. He told him how to build the tabernacle. He gave him specific what's the word? Somebody help me out. Instructions, there you go. Special blueprints on how to build the tabernacle. God laid out the sacrificial system for them. This was God's doing, but once again, it was to point them to the fact that sacrificial system was incomplete. We talked about how it was just a symbol of what God would do through Jesus Christ, and a symbol of that heavenly tabernacle that Jesus ministers to in heaven now. The Old Testament system had a method of worship and a building for worship that was specifically prescribed by God. But we talked about how Christ's ministry is in a heavenly sanctuary. All right, so let's begin reading there. We're going to begin reading Hebrews chapter 9, beginning in verse 1. It said, "Then indeed, even the first covenant had its ordinances of divine service and the earthly sanctuary." Once again, it had its practices based on divine service. God laid it out, right? And it had an earthly sanctuary, a tabernacle that was on this earth, one that was temporary. It says, "For a tabernacle was prepared the first part, in which was the lampstand, the table, and the showbread, which is called the sanctuary." Okay, so we see this is the first part of the tabernacle, and we see a list of the things that are in there. The lampstand, the table, and the showbread, which is called the sanctuary. And behind the second veil, the part of the tabernacle, which is called the holiest of all, or the holiest of holies. Okay, that would be the part that the priest went into once a year on the Day of Atonement. It says the second veil there. Many times if you go online and look at some diagrams of the tabernacle, you will see the tabernacle, and then there's sort of a wall that goes around the outside of it. You had the court of the Gentiles, where only the Gentiles could go. And then you had that first veil, which basically entered into the tabernacle, where we see this. The holiest of all, as we see here in verse 3. That is the place that the priest would go once a year, which had the golden censer and the ark of the covenant overlaid with all sides with gold, in which were the golden pot that had manna, Aaron's rod that budded, and the tablets of the covenant, the ten commandments there. And above it there was a cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things which we cannot speak in detail. Now when these things had been thus prepared, the priest always went into the first part of the tabernacle performing the services. This was the part of the tabernacle that he went to on a daily basis there. But into the second part, the high priest went alone once a year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the people's sins committed in ignorance. The Holy Spirit indicating this, that the way into the holiest of all was not yet made manifest while the first tabernacle was still standing. It was symbolic for the present time in which both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make him who performed the service perfect in regard to their conscience. Once again, talking about these sacrifices that the priest offered. They could not make one perfect. Concerned only with foods and drinks, various washings, and the fleshly ordinances imposed until the time of Reformation.